Good afternoon, everybody. I think Annette had to take a call, so same drill, same different day. Put your name and then in your organization in the chat box for us, and we'll start in a minute or two.
Excellent. It's good to see everybody again. We've had a busy day back and forth with cohort 15 and cohort 16. And we're excited to be here now with Y4Y and Yana and crew. As always, they're the experts that help us all learn and grow and be able to serve better. A couple of updates from our office that are real short. Cognia, we know there's a problem. We've been working with them to try to get everything worked out, but don't panic. If you're due for compliance monitoring, just make sure you have all your ducks in a row. So when it does open up, you're ready to upload. I know it's a lot of information, and we definitely will be compassionate with that. So just hang on, just make sure you have everything ready when we do our TA and when we actually do the compliance monitoring, however that may be. But don't panic if Cognia is still giving us troubles. The good news is we have a series with Y4Y that we will send out in Friday's email, how they're going to build upon. So both the cohort trainings today are going to build upon what they're going to teach us today and go over. And then, like we encouraged you, go to Y4Y and really download and look at their webinars, look at their forums, and help them manage your program as you move into the next phase of it. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Yana and let her introduce the crew and get started. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having us, Annette. It's so great to be with you. And it's so great to be with you all virtually. I know I saw many of you in, I believe it was October. I was down with you all for one day. So we will be seeing quite a lot of each other, which is so much fun. But thank you all for being with us. Today, we're going to do some talking about managing your program. And I know many of you are new leaders. You're just getting started with your compliance process. So we'll be sharing a lot of great tools that you can use to help you keep track of all those moving parts. Before we get started, we have to play a quick disclaimer from the Department of Education.
This presentation was produced under U.S. Department of Education contract number ED-ESE 14D0008 with Synergy Enterprises Incorporated. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, methodology, technique, or enterprise mentioned here is intended or should be inferred.
All right. Now that is out of the way, I am so glad to be with you all. I'm just introducing myself again. My name is Yana List. I have been with the Y4Y team for a little over 3 years, and I come from a background as a school day, after school, summer educator, project leader. So I have done a lot of the work that you've already done, living in Philadelphia now, but formerly of the Eastern Shore. So it's great to be with y'all and to be back with my crowd. And I'm joined by my colleague, Shanika Peck. Hey, Shanika.
Hey, Yana, thank you so much. My name is Shanika Peck. I'm the lead education specialist for the Y4Y's technical assistance team. Actually been with Y4Y for about a year. I'm actually excited to be presenting with Yana today with you all. I'm coming in from, the classroom background. I served about 8 years serving as a lead teacher, lead instructor, and intervention coordinator for students between pre-K to 8th grade in a year-round residential boarding school. And then during the summer, work with high school students with career exploration activities. So definitely excited to hear about your experiences as you jumpstart your program, your compliance, all those great things. And of course, we always have a lot of great tools to share with you all to make it easier. Oops, sorry, Yana, you're muted.
I'm sorry, I got a little confuzzled with all my buttons for just a second there. We're all old hat at using Zoom right now, but we will be doing some interactions. So please respond, use the chat box as you've all already been using to let us know what you think and to share your opinions and share your expertise, because you all come in from different environments and different experiences, and you have, I'm sure, a lot to share that Shanika and I will share our tips and what we've learned from our experiences and interacting with so many other professionals all across the country, but we love to hear from you always. So to start off, we just want to make sure we're all on the same page about our objectives. So today we're going to explore some of the critical program management tasks that you need to be successful managing and overseeing your program. We're going to identify how you can craft some management plans to be really successful. And we're also going to talk about a lot of free resources that come from Y4Y that you can use to better run and manage your program. And one of the things that we always love to mention is that everything on our website is completely free, completely customizable. Shanika will be sharing in the chat box the handout we have for today, and that has all the links to all the tools we will mention, but this is just a little bit taste of all the tools we have available. There are literally hundreds at this point on our website, so please do take the time to research them. We are going to be talking about project management, but we have many other, over 20 other courses and so many resources on our website, so please do check those out. But we're going to start off talking about project management. And it's so important, especially for those of you that are new leaders, to get your materials organized, to understand all the elements of your budget, to understand all the elements of running your project successfully. And the reason that's so important is because, first of all, when it comes to monitoring and it comes to reporting to your state leadership, you have to have all your ducks in a row, borrowing Annette's phrase, to make sure that you are staying in compliance, you're able to maintain your funding, all of those elements. And also because it will help you be more successful, less stressed out. If all of those documents, all of the information you need is organized and clearly available to you whenever there's questions, and it will just help the longevity of your program to make sure that you are able to carry those skills, that information year to year. And when we talk about project management, what we mean is the application of knowledge, skills, tools, and techniques for project activities to meet project requirements. So you have a certain number of goals. Those are defined by ESSA, what you're supposed to be accomplishing in your 21st century program. And we want to use project management to use concrete knowledge, skills, tools in order to design and implement and oversee programs that are meeting those ESSA requirements, meeting the requirements of your state, really with the ultimate goal of meeting the learning needs of our students. And when we talk about our 21st CCLCs, as we all know, the funding is limited. It is a time-limited project. You get 3 to 5 years. Sometimes there is the option to renew. I know some of you maybe had a year off and have those grants again, but of course we know that money is not guaranteed. So we do want to talk about some strategies you can use to maintain your program even if that 21st century funding comes to an end. And everything we're going to be talking about in terms of funding and managing your budget really applies for finding external funders to supplement the funds that you already have as a result of 21st century programming, because we know that even though you have your budget, it might not be enough. You might want to bring in other extra special partners and projects. And so we may need to supplement our funding in those ways as well. And as we're going to be talking about managing our budget, project management on our website is a really long course with a lot of different pieces, because we know that overseeing and running programs is a really big job that has a lot of components to it. And it really has 5 general phases. and we're going to be picking and choosing and just talking about a few elements of this, again, because we don't have time for everything. So we're going to talk a little bit about getting your project off on the right foot, getting set up, and really we're going to talk a lot about how do we plan and execute our projects effectively, and especially that monitoring and controlling. How do we make sure that we're keeping track of all our data on a regular basis to make sure that we are running our projects effectively and in compliance. And so to start us off, I'm going to turn it over to Shanika, and Shanika is going to talk a little bit about those first steps relating to initiating that project. So Shanika, over to you.
Thank you, Yana. So as Yana mentioned before, with our program project checklist, we have several critical tasks that you can use just to help you set up that foundation of creating an effective project plan. So what we'll do is take some time to get to know, your grant and its requirements. And of course, if you're following along with us, using that checklist, it's in the handout that I shared in the chat. Go ahead and download that. Feel free to follow along with us as we go through it. I know Yana mentioned this earlier before. We will, pick a few areas to focus on because of time. But of course, if you have any questions about the planning or any other tools that can be beneficial, please feel free to ask at the end. But first, we're going to talk about how we can initiate our grant and gain a better understanding. So again, we're focused on our grant and requirements, but usually in the critical task, there's a number of different things that you can do, such as identifying your stakeholders, defining your program, and creating that project plan, which we'll talk more about as we move along. So starting with the first critical task, know your grant, we're really going to focus on the grant proposal itself. And, this is very important because some of you may or may not have been a part of that planning process. And so it's important for you to not only know about, what your proposal is saying about your program, but also about its requirements at a state and federal level. So we'll go ahead and take a look at the different elements for knowing your grant. So when it comes to knowing your grant, we're focused on the cost, scope, quality, and time. So when you're focused on the cost, you're really thinking about, well, what budget was proposed in this proposal, right? You also want to validate your budget by working with, your state to review. You're determining funds that should be appropriated correctly. If you need to make amendments, what are what's the procedure behind that? You're also thinking about the scope, right? So what did the proposal say you would do with your program? And if there's anything that needs greater definition before you write, your whole project plan. You're also thinking about the quality, right? What quality indicators did you propose? You're thinking about the program or project plan effectiveness. You're thinking about your activity designs, what learning approaches or methods you're going to use. You're thinking about plans such as communication, your staffing plan, professional development. All of that is tied into the overall quality of your grant proposal. And then of course, time, right? How much time do you have to do the work? And in this case, we're thinking about what operations plan you propose to get this job done. So what we'll do is, because there's so much happening in this piece, you really want to start with data and collecting anything that's new to help you further flesh out your project plan. So, why for why we always use these 3 buckets of data when it comes to defining our program and also measuring how effective we are. So with the data that we encourage you to use, it'll help you determine the what, the why, and how to intentionally design program routines and activities. So we're talking about that school level data, student level data, student voice. All of these things can help you to stay focused on your grant. And of course, if you're collecting new data, it's really important that you communicate if your current data and its needs are starting to look different from those that's been submitted with your grant. So once you've collected that data, you're analyzing it with your team, you're writing those need assessment statements that'll eventually fuel your program SMART goals. And this is all important. This is the foundation of how you will measure the effectiveness of your program as well. So that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to initiating this process group. Again, if you're following along with us, we are working our way through critical tasks 1 through 4. But of course, you're thinking about how you're going to develop your project plan. And as you're thinking about developing your project plan, you're also thinking about how you are going to implement this process once all the planning is done. So once you understand the requirements of your grant, it's really important that you sit down with your program planning team to define what your program needs are, and then you will be ready to develop your project plan. So this plan, you should definitely think about all of the moving parts that you have to manage. And essentially your project plan will describe the who, what, how, and why of your 21st CCLC program. So what you'll do is, again, use that checklist to follow along, but let's go ahead and just think about some questions to help us guide our planning of our program plan. Right, so on the screen, you'll see a couple of questions that touch base, that actually talks about the 4 elements that we discussed earlier, the scope, the cost, the quality, the time. And we really just want you guys to use your annotation tool and just check off what questions you think you should focus on as you develop your program or project plan. So again, if you remember, your annotation tool is right at the top. If you hover over the top of your screen where it says view options, you should be able to click the annotation tool. If not, you can use the chat box, right? So again, we're thinking about what questions we would want to see answered with our plan. So you're thinking about what needs to happen before you start. No problem, Yana. Yep, so again, we're looking at the screen and we're thinking about these questions that we would like our plan to answer. So if, it's January, we've had some experience with our program, maybe you would like your project plan to be more focused on how much money your site will be spending, right? Because we definitely need to be thinking about the cost here, especially if you need to be making any budget amendments that will affect your overall program. So again, you can use your annotation tool to check off what questions, or you can just put a question in the chat. What would you like your plan to answer? Now, Yana, I know that you have a lot of experience with 21st CCLC programs. What's a question that you would definitely keep in mind? It's January. What should we be thinking about at this point in time?
So one of the things that I think we need to consider all year round is how is our program meeting the needs of students? So I know all of you probably conducted a needs assessment right at the beginning of your program year, but making sure that you're keeping that up to date, doing that consistent progress monitoring, doing ongoing data collection, and sometimes that might mean making some changes to our implementation to make sure we are meeting those program needs, those student and family needs, excuse me.
Thank you, Yana. And I see, thank you, Brad, for sharing. How will my program demonstrate performance? So you're already thinking about the quality, right? You want to make sure that your program is definitely meeting the needs of your student and your families. So of course, at this point, we're thinking about a lot of critical questions that will eventually ensure the effectiveness of our project management plans. And at this point, maybe you're just reading over the questions, just jotting down some questions that stuck out to you. You're still processing it, which is fine. But you also need to think about, what kind of information you need to start gathering if you aren't already gathering it today. So like I mentioned before, those first couple of critical tasks, we briefly went over. is to help you set up some planning around what your project plan should look like. So what we're going to do is just move on to the next couple of critical tasks that you can find on our checklists. Again, that checklist is in the handout that I shared in the chat box. I'll share it one more time in a little bit, but this should give you an idea of the importance around planning. And then the next critical task, 5 through 11, this is where all of the heavy lifting is. It'll definitely take some time for you to sit down with your team after, taking some time to get to know your proposal, you're reviewing your data and things like that. You really want to take some time to just digest it and figure out what needs to happen in order for you to effectively plan for your program. And so a tool that is very helpful when it comes to things like this is really just creating policies and procedures for each of these plans. And of course, Y for Y, we have a sample policies and procedures guidebook that you can use to help you outline those plans and expectations so that you are, implementing with fidelity when it comes to your program. But, because of time, we're going to focus on fiscal management plans. We're going to focus on data management plans, communications and outreach plan, and quality assurance plan. So as you can see, there's about 7 areas that you can focus on, but, we're short on time today, so we're only going to focus on 4, but you can find all of these areas in that checklist. So as you follow along, again, jot down some questions if you as you come across them while we move throughout this presentation. So I'm actually going to hand it back over to Yana, and she's going to get us started with that fiscal and data management plan.
Thanks, Shanika. So fiscal management is one of those things I know from my experience coming from, many years in education, but when I came into a project leader role, I didn't really have much experience with fiscal management. So I had to figure it out kind of on the job, which might be true for a lot of you as well. Because if you're an educator, managing a budget is usually not part of your job. So we know that is one of the challenges that we can encounter. We know that one of the challenges that we encounter may be that we don't have total control of our budgets, especially if your grant recipient is your school district versus a community-based organization. You might have a more direct relationship with the funding office or with the finance office in a smaller organization like a CBO, whereas a large district, a lot of those budget pieces are handled on the central office level. So there are some challenges with fiscal management. And one of the things that we emphasize that I believe we've mentioned before, and Shanika has definitely mentioned, of the importance of having those strong relationships with the school day and with your finance office, whether that is on the district level, if your grant recipient is a school district, or on the community-based organization, if there is an accountant or a finance chair in your organization. Having that clear communication so you understand the ins and outs of your budget is going to be really important, especially if you have limited control over the elements of your budget. So as we're thinking about our budget, there are 6 general categories of expenses that could come up for your program. And as we're talking about those budgetary elements, we are going to give some examples, just making sure that we align these. And one of the things that's really important is to track your expenses according to the line item, because when your budget was proposed to the state, things were sorted by line item. So you need to know how are you going to track and submit the different expenses, and making sure that you can track those expenses according to the correct category. So our general categories for our budget include personnel. So personnel is obviously your staff expenses, but your staff also might have fringe benefits. And those are in most programs, the vast majority of your budget. It might be as much as 80 to 85% of your budget is just going to paying your staff because obviously your staff are central to your project implementation. Then transportation, we know one of the things that you may need to provide, it's going to depend on your program, is you may need to provide transportation to your program. So if your site is not taking place in a school, then you may need to bring students to your program site at the end of the school day to get started. You also need to think about your contractual expenses. That is if you pay any outside vendors for your program, that might include your independent evaluator. If you bring in external trainers, although things like Y4Y training are free to you, if you use any kind of specific software, all of those are examples of contractual expenses because those are really how you're signing contracts and paying external vendors and external providers. We also have to think about our capital outlay. So capital outlay is really the expenses tied to the building or the organization where your organization is housed, so that, or where your program is housed, excuse me. So things like computers, smart boards, other expensive equipment will fall into that. And some of those expenses may be allowable, but those are often where you should reach out to your state coordinator, to Annette or someone in her office, to one of her regional representatives to confirm that those kinds of expenses are allowed, because a lot of those capital outlay expenses are not allowed under 21st century funds. Then there are things like supplies. So that is all your program supplies, pencils, markers, STEM materials that you need for any student projects. All of those pieces that are really necessary for the implementation of your project, those might take up somewhere between 7 and 10% of your budget each year. But these are often those kind of small expenses that you have throughout the year for different projects. And those can often be the hardest to keep track of because you end up with a million receipts. But again, that's one of those things that one of the challenges of being a project leader is you have to keep track of all your receipts because come reporting time, those are going to be very, very important. And finally, there are indirect costs, and those are things like any cost for administering the grant, like accounting expenses. So if you hire an external accountant to manage your budget, things like that, those are indirect costs that are people who do not directly are not directly involved in the implementation of your project. So now that we've gone over those general 6 categories, and again, it's going to be really important for you to keep track of the categories in your budget because those have to be reported, as the line items in your budget when it comes to reporting time and tracking your budget. So we would love to play a little game where we are going to, or I am going to read you a scenario that you might come across. And we would love for you to use the annotation tool in order to tell us which element of the budget does this align with, which category does this align with. And as a reminder, your annotation tool should be along the top of your screen. You can click on annotate, and then you should be able to mark on the screen. And if you're not seeing your annotate button for whatever reason, you can also just type in the chat box, whatever is easier for you. So let's play a little game. So to start off with, let's look at the first example. So you want to bring in an expert to train your team on using a new data tracking software. Would that be an example? What kind of budget expense would that be? Would that be an example of personnel, transportation, contractual, capital outlay, supplies, or indirect costs? You can let us know in the chat box if you'd like. You want to bring in an external expert to train your staff. Yes, exactly. That's an example of contractual. That may be a really important, useful resource for your program if you're using specific software, especially if your out of school time staff are not school day staff and you're using similar or the same software that the school uses or your school district uses, but your staff aren't familiar with. Bringing in that trainer could be really important and reap great rewards, and that would be an example of a contractual expense. What about if you have two 21st century staff members that you want to send to an out of school time conference for some professional development or for some training? And as a reminder, you are allowed and your staff are required to have some professional development. So you decide to send two of your staff, for example, to the mega conference this summer or to another conference. What kind of expense would that be if you are sending them to travel somewhere? Yes, so that will typically be transportation because you will probably need to pay their gas if they're driving, or maybe even for a flight if they have to fly somewhere farther away. Yes, exactly. That's an example of transportation. What if you have a program, you have an art program and you need to purchase some new paints and some new canvases for your art teacher? What would that, yep, exactly right. You all don't need me for that. That is an example of supplies, right? And those can be very necessary. Great if you can offer art in your program, but those are going to be those little expenses along the way that compared to the rest of your budget is fairly small, but you do need to keep track of those receipts. How about if you need to buy some tablets for some really innovative, exciting STEM activities? Students are going to get to do some field work out in local nature in a local park, but you need to buy some like tablets. So those are a pretty large expense. So I'm seeing a lot of people say these are a supply. So typically we will classify technology purchases as a capital outlay because they are those large expenses. And many of those expenditures are not generally allowable under the 21st century grant, but you can get a waiver from your state leadership. So we know when COVID-19 started and so many programs went to virtual, a lot of state leaders signed waivers for their programs to purchase technology so that they can continue to offer virtual programs. So those purchases of tablets may very well be allowable, but that is where you should reach out to your regional representative to get some confirmation that that is something that's allowable. But if tablets are an essential part of a really cool STEM program that's going to be an amazing learning opportunity for your students, of course, we want to provide those. We just have to make sure that those will be allowable under the requirements of our grant. How about if you are having some trouble with the budget and you decide to hire, you're based in a small organization, and you decide that you really need to hire a accountant to help you manage the budget and oversee the budget just on a part-time basis. But if you need to hire an accountant, what would that be? Yes, that's an example of an indirect cost. Because the accountant is an essential part of your program implementation, but it's not a direct element of the actual implementation of your project. It's really one of those oversight expenses that we talked about, one of those expenses that's necessary for the implementation of your grant, the implementation of your funding. How about if you want to rent a bus to take your students on a field trip, and you want to take your students on a field trip to the local zoo, you got a great deal, or maybe even you got free tickets, but you need to take your students on that field trip. Yes, exactly. Transportation. Keep in mind, transportation in the state, fantastic. Taking your students across state lines would be kidnapping. Don't do that without explicit permission, and you need some like very detailed paperwork. So generally speaking, within the state, but yes, renting a bus, going on an awesome field trip, if that is an enriching learning opportunity for the students, for example, as a former science teacher, I would take my students to the zoo, and if we were studying mammals, we would go to the mammals, and they would get to learn a lot about those animals and have that firsthand experience. Again, those field trips should be an enriching learning opportunity, and a trip to the zoo definitely could qualify, or a trip to the aquarium. I'm just listing field trips that I have taken my students to, so they're all very science forward. But great, so we are very clear on those elements of the budget. And again, I think it's just important to note that this is going to be important when it comes to reporting time, when the website is working again, because you do have to be able to track all the different expenses that you have to know this is how much we've spent from each line item, because you did submit those estimates when you submitted and were approved for your grant. So now that we've talked a little bit about how we can make sure that we're tracking those elements of our budget, I want to turn it over to Shanika, and Shanika is going to talk a little bit about sustainability planning. Shanika, over to you.
Oh, thanks, Yana. So sustainability planning is actually very helpful if you start from the very beginning instead of waiting until the last minute. So with this plan, you're describing the strategy that you're going to use to help your program to continue after those 21st CCLC funds, the funding ends. So sustainability is, it's usually, viewed as a discussion instead of an action item in the very beginning, but of course it does require you to know your grant, of course, your grant period, and it's also a good place for you to start thinking about different practices. So here are some strategies when it comes to developing your sustainability plan, right? Again, like I mentioned before, it's really helpful that you start planning early. And of course, build it into everything that you're doing. So if you're monitoring your budget, you're thinking about, well, how else can I get these things without the extra costs? For each year of 21st CCLC funding, you may need to define a focus area that will set up your program for a successful, sustained operation. Another good tip is to engage stakeholders. Right? You may have someone on your team that can help you with defining, what you should be focused on when it comes to sustainability. You can also allow stakeholders to have some kind of ownership over over different parts of this program, right? So they can share different ideas or opportunities to help you with sustaining your program without those 21st CCLC funds. And of course, making connections, right? There are different pools of funds that you can use. Definitely go out and network. And what you can do is tell your story. So that data that you've collected in the very beginning of, creating your plan and knowing your grant, you can actually use that data to not only, help you with evaluation, but if you have some success, you're using that in your story and you're sharing that with possible partners to help you continue all of the great work that you're going to do or are currently doing. You're also thinking about different kinds of in-kind services, right? So you may be thinking about things that you can get for free, right? Maybe you are networking with a program or an organization that loves the work that you're doing with STEM and would like to contribute to the great work that you're doing in there. And of course, like I mentioned before, well, actually kind of touched on this when it comes to figuring out or making connections with other partnerships in the area, but definitely think about other existing sources of support. Sometimes you can find school-based funding sources. There's a lot of government organizations that can help. Community-based organizations can help too if you aren't a CBO. you definitely want to pay attention to the goals. So you can use your goals and see how much it aligns with those different organizations and see what you guys can do for each other, right? Maybe they can offer free services while you are providing space. So there's definitely a lot you can do as long as you collaborate and, you know, are willing to share resources, just really help each other reach different milestones and goals. So I'm going to actually share this handout one more time, but we also have a tool you can use to help you with sustainability planning, right? There's a couple of key questions. It gives you more suggestions on things that you can think about or use as you go throughout your planning cycle. I'm going to do a PDF version and a Word version in there, just in case it's hard to open. But yes, that's just another tool that Y4Y has for you. A lot of our tools are also customizable, so you can go in there, download the editable version, editable version, and just make some updates to it that matches your program best. Now, in addition to creating a sustainability plan, you're also thinking about that data management plan. So this includes, in the beginning, we defined our program, but of course, you're thinking about how you are going to use this data to intentionally design your activities, right? So when you're using this data and you're thinking about improvements, you're actually using that continuous improvement process. And of course, that is something that is discussed on our site as well. But as you do this, you're also developing those policies and procedures to support that data plan. And again, that can be found in the checklist in that handout. So again, if you've downloaded it, great, make sure you're following along. But in that checklist, it actually helps you to identify different data points. Sometimes we don't always have access to data that could be beneficial in that moment. There are other pieces of data that you can use instead. We also have a couple of tools that you can use to help you start that data collection. And of course, the language that you can use around data, collecting data. Now, let's go ahead and take a break from me talking, and let's talk about different pieces of data that you will need for your year. Thank you. All right, so what types of data do you need to collect to fulfill federal requirements? Right, so federal demands include having states and grantees complete an annual performance report. And while you want to capture many different types of data, you may have to specify the data that you must track for all of your regular students. So if you have students who are attending your program for 30 days or more throughout the year, what kind of data will you need from them? Or in the chat, how about you share what other types of data that you have collected? So I've seen programs use state report cards. Some programs use surveys from families and students. Now, as you're collecting this different data, you definitely want to make sure you're capturing the success of your students. And this will help you with sustainability as well. Great. Thank you for sharing that. So you guys all use easy reports to collect some data. And this data may be informal or formal assessments, right? This may be a conversation you have with family, or if you're reaching out to teachers, you may be collecting data that way as well. All right.
Yes, Annette chimed in that you all use easy reports, and that is a great tool that you can use to gather all that data in a central location.
Now, I do have a question about data. Let's say because, technology happens, sometimes it fails. What if we don't have access to this right away? What else can we use instead? You have any advice around that, Yana?
So I am personally, and Shanika brought this up because she knows that I am someone who likes to have 2 copies of everything. So I personally do keep duplicate copies of all my documentation because you never know if something doesn't get saved. Those things we know happen with technology all the time. So Y4Y actually has some great tools for tracking data and tracking that information in case, for example, right now the website is down, but you do still need to collect that data. I personally am a big believer in maintaining a hard copy as well, but that's me personally. But we do know that technology challenges come up a lot. And so being prepared for that and having the tools in order to keep that data so you don't lose it, you don't have to do all your data collection a second time is really, really valuable.
Yep, and like what Yana mentioned, we definitely have a lot of tools that can help you, especially keep up with it on a hard copy. So you can print it out, fill it in as you go, or possibly just keep it on your, download it to your, your laptop or computer and just have it in your personal files just in case. But, whether your state completes APR report, or maybe you have someone else in charge of, collecting that data, here are some example tools, data collection tools that you can use. So you have your easy reports, like what Annette shared. Maybe you are using student report cards. I've seen programs have student report card parties. So they have students bring in those report cards with their families. You're able to discuss it. You see how the language around communicating skills that students are addressing in the school day and how you can address it in your program. You may be using state assessment reports. Teacher surveys are very helpful, especially when it comes to your program, possibly facilitating small group learning or student tutoring. You can also use enrollment forms to help out with data as well. Now we're going to jump forward. We're going to go straight into critical task 10, which is focus on our communications and outreach plans. And we're going to just briefly discuss, the internal communication plan, external outreach, and marketing plan. So, one of my favorite things about virtual TA is that you can hear from people all over the state, sometimes the country, depending on, the session. But it will be great if I can hear some of the things that you are currently doing right now to communicate to your students and stakeholders. So when we're thinking about internal communications, are you having weekly meetings? Do you have different assignments for students? How are you following up with staff? When we're thinking about external communication, how are you reaching out to students and families? Are you connecting with teachers on a daily basis? Are there other things that you would like to focus on when it comes to communication? So feel free to, share what you are currently doing with communication in your program so that we can steal some ideas and try to apply it to our own programs as well. So while you're adding your what you're currently doing about communication in the chat, I mentioned this before, I've seen programs have report card parties. That's really fun. I think that's helpful when it comes to figuring out what skills that you should address in your program, especially if students need that extra support. Ooh, and that mentioned Remind 101 app. Is that an app that's used by all programs in the state to reach out to staff, students, families? So Yana, what kind of what are you doing with communication?
So Remind app is a great one, and some people are mentioning that they use that for parent communication. It's a great way to send out a notice if there's a snow day and you have to close early, as an example, that's some that you probably don't encounter very much in Alabama, but we encounter more in our area. If there's a tornado warning, something like that. All of those are examples where Remind really comes in handy because it goes right to your phone. Of course, sending out a regular newsletter. One of the things that I love doing is, especially if you have like middle school or high school students, having them in charge of writing and creating the newsletter, because that is both a learning experience for them because they have to learn how to do, graphic design and writing for a general audience, all of those pieces, and it takes something off your plate. So that's something I'm a big believer in. Having that regular communication, I think, is just key. Whatever method you decide to use, most of us are probably communicating digitally nowadays, but whatever method you're using, just to make it regular, maybe using social media like Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, any of those, but also following safety precautions, making sure you're not uploading students' faces unless you have parent permission to take photographs and upload those to your social media. So do make sure that you have those approvals available, but that is a great way to reach out and to share all the great things that your program is doing, showing how much fun your students are having during program time as well.
Yeah, but I like the idea of using students to help you with communication. I've also seen communication going out as just a very short clip or, like a video so that, everyone can have access to it. And it's just straight to the point instead of doing a lot of reading. Sherry shared that they use a closed Facebook group. That's really important, that you don't have it open to everyone, of course, but that's just it's easily accessible for everyone in your program. So as we move on, we're thinking about internal communications. You're thinking about who needs to be involved when it comes to communicating to them. So for example, you're thinking about people in your program who will help execute your program or possibly will be impacted by it, right? So you may have to communicate with a principal or school secretary because they usually have a lot of information on everyone's schedule and they can help you with your communication plan. I've seen school secretaries add reminders from programs into student folders. That's very helpful. But you're probably also thinking about food services, right? Staff that you must, communicate with either on a daily basis, maybe weekly basis, when it comes to maybe principals and school day professionals. Maybe you're thinking about meeting with them bi-weekly or maybe on a monthly basis, things like that. You're also thinking about, the methods of communication. So you guys are using social media, you have apps. Of course, there could be email. Some people still read their email, maybe the first line of an email and that's it. So maybe you want to think about how long your message is if you're using email. Phone calls, automated phone calls as well, just leaving voicemail messages. Virtual has definitely changed the world for us all. We can meet with literally anyone, anywhere, at any time. And of course, in person. When we're thinking about external communication, again, we're starting with our stakeholders, right? You may be thinking about the partnerships that you have in the community, whether it be a library or another CVO or outside partners that you need to continue to build relationship with. So maybe you are thinking about how you can communicate your success story so that you can, establish some kind of additional funding to help you with sustainability, all of those things you can definitely think about. But also reach out to them to see what their preferred method of communication is, right? So some partners like to receive little mail with updates or postcards so that they can have it up in their organization to show their, participation in your program. You're also thinking about how often you should be communicating with them, whether it be daily, weekly, monthly, on a quarterly basis. And then we're going to move into that quality assurance plan. So we're getting closer to the end of our management plans. And when it comes to quality assurance plan, we're thinking about our overall project plan, the timeline that we have in place for it. We mentioned having a sample policy and procedure guidebook just to keep everyone on track and focused on your program goals and its requirements. And of course, you guys are all at that point where you're thinking about your evaluation, right? So all that requires some planning before it gets executed. And like I mentioned before, with that sample policies and procedures book, it also offers you the language around how you can communicate your management plan. So those are all some important things. Now, as we get towards the end with wrapping up our management plans, we're thinking about how we can finalize our project plan. So you're thinking about the very beginning, right? Your program goals, your overall critical task, your program may be using a logic model, right? So maybe you have an overarching goal and specific objectives. In this policy or procedure, maybe you have an objective for each activity, your desired outcomes. You probably have staff members responsible for carrying out specific activities to get the job done. You're probably also thinking about the appropriate evaluation tools, and of course the timeline, right? Because it's really important that as a leader, you're showing how you've worked to keep your program going. You're thinking about the design, how it's being implemented, and how you're assessing your program for quality and compliance. So, you probably know at this point, federal guidelines indicate that, our grantees participate in periodic independent evaluation. So maybe you're thinking about how you can get someone involved for that. You're thinking about comprehensive needs assessment. You're using the data that you've collected at the beginning and throughout your program, and thinking about how you can conduct an annual cycle of continuous improvement, right? Because we're collecting all this data and we're looking at it, but we want to make sure that we're using it so that we can continue to improve our program to best fit the needs of our students and our families. Now, we do have some tips for you when it comes to developing your evaluation plan. You may hire a qualified evaluator outside of your state's requirement. You may construct a logic model, which, by the way, Y4Y does have a tool that gives you an example and an outline of what that logic model can look like for your program. I just added that to the chat. You are creating and using SMART goals, right? That also helps you evaluate the effectiveness of your program. You're setting up evaluation questions. Make sure you have a plan for measuring. And of course, you're capturing data and you're using that data to improve your program. Now, in addition to that checklist that we shared in the handout, the logic model example there, we also have other additional trainings that you can use. If you are in charge of training or professional development in your program, we have trainings to go, readily accessible to you on the website. All you have to do is download the PowerPoint. There's notes in there, so you can, take a look at it in like an hour before, get yourself ready, and just go ahead and train your staff on whether it's building a comprehensive schedule. Maybe you want to train your staff on identifying and addressing program strengths and weaknesses, because again, we're thinking about, our program's effectiveness. There's also a training on a staff handbook, and of course, understanding FERPA, which is really important when it comes to data. Am I missing anything else, Yana? No,
we have lots of resources, just as Shanika mentioned, and we will be with you on a pretty regular basis over the next few months. So I am so glad that we're going to continue having this conversation. And just to add, if you are not already on our mailing list, it is easy to join. You can join our mailing list to get a monthly email update on new resources on our website, upcoming webinars, and really hot topics in education, interviews with experts, tons of great resources. You can join by texting Y4Y Insider to 22828. Text and data rates may apply, so you can also join by going to our website, y4y.ed.gov, and signing up directly on our homepage. Thank you all so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time, and I look forward to seeing you again next month. You can always visit on our website, y4y.ed.gov, or you can email us at y4yta@seiservices.com. And thank you all so much for being with us. And Annette, thank you so much for inviting us.
Thank you. As always, y'all are wonderful, and all the information that you provide is just amazing. And I took 1 page of notes, so that's just something that I will continue to grow and to learn on and pass on to the grantees. We look forward to seeing you next month as we grow on this. And I put a few notes in the chat for everyone that's on today, just reminders of anything from our updates. And I wish you all a very wonderful evening, and I will see some of you pretty soon on the 17th. Thank you again, Yana.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.